It's the 18th of August, 1997, and we're here in Bath, England, to talk on behalf of the Video Legacy Programme of the International Society of Nephrology to Dr. Mark Joekes. Mark, we've always called you Joe, so I think I'll call you Joe, if that's all right by you. Joe, Joekes is an unusual name in England. Tell us a bit about that.
Well, it's a Dutch name, and I, in fact, was, by the length of my nose, born in Holland. But my father was employed by the Medical Research Council over here, and I'm not sure what he was working on at the time. He was really a pathologist, basically, although he had been a clinician, and he worked up at Hampstead in the old MRC buildings there.
So that was some of your medical family background, if you
So
like.
that was my medical family. And curiously, my mother also qualified as a doctor, but never practiced. She's one of the earlier women to qualify as a doctor. And they both qualified in Leiden, I think. And my father was a fairly well-known athlete. He stroked the Leiden boat. And
so the family was from Leiden?
Well, my grandfather was the governor of Sumatra, and my father was born actually in Borneo, and he was there for the first 15 years of his life.
With the Dutch East India Company.
And then he had two brothers, one of whom became a well-known politician, and had a lot to do with the Dutch East Indies. But I never lived in Holland at all.
You did mention to me once that you were very distantly related through your mother's family to Pim Colf, whom we'll talk about.
Well, I'm not sure if I'm so vague about this. I'm not sure if it was through my mother or through my father that we were related, but he lived in one of his father was a shipmaster and owned a fleet of fishing boats, which was known as the herring fleet over there, where they got a lot of herring in those days. I don't know if they do still. And this was on Goeree and Overvlakke, which is the northernmost of the islands at the mouth of the Rhine and Scheldt. And he had a tower with a bell on the top of his house where some poor citizen used to sit and tell him when his fleet was coming in. So you could go there to see that there was no hokey-pokey going on when they arrived.
But you were brought up and educated in England?
Absolutely. I never lived in Holland.
And then you went to Barts and trained?
I went to Oxford and then I went to Barts.
And after that you applied to join the MRC, I believe.
Well, I was shoved into the MRC. I never knew how it happened. Anyway, I had this letter when I was down in Chichester to say that I was appointed as an MRC, whatever it was in those days.
That you were a registrar in
I was a
resident
registrar
in
medicine.
This was about when, 1940?
1941, too. And I was then, and I sent to the unit which was based at Queen Square, the Hospital for Nervous Diseases in Queen Square, where there was an MRC unit under Dr. A.E. Carmichael, and I was part of that. And there were, in fact, I think, one of the brothers, the McCardles. Did you remember that?
Yes, I knew both black and red McCardle.
That's right. This was the black McCardle.
Of McCardle's disease.
The red McCardle was. I think did he go to stay at Guy's?
Yes, both were Guy's.
Yes, well, but but black was. But he then came across the MRC, and he was a very, very intelligent, very bright boy, and so in a sense I was under his aegis rather than Carmichael. And we were, the first thing we had to do was to work on motion sickness for the Navy and the Army when they were transported. And we did actually find out there was a certain tablet you were given against seasickness. So, and we had two sources of this. And one of these was a British source and the other was a German source from Merck, I think it was. And when the trials were started, we used to have enormous swings in one of the great big old halls in Queen Square, where we had great swings, and we used to swing. We did it ourselves. We swung volunteers from the army on this till they puked. And then we gave them tablets, and we found that one of the Merck set of tablets stopped them puking and the other didn't.
Yeah.
And
Very practical research.
were very practical research, no, not highly intelligent. And we then thought that was very odd, so we had them analysed, because they were supposed to exactly the same tablet, and one worked and the other didn't. And it was found that the British, in the best tradition, had failed to put in the hyoscine, which they did in there. And so it was then established that this particular thing, whatever it was called...
Still used, of course.
It was still used, yes. And that hyoscine was the stuff that mattered. And so all troops, all military establishments, Navy, Army and what have you, because it was just tried out in the rough seas of the Channel to see that it did really work. And they were told that they must take this if they're going for sea voyages. And when they invaded, I think it was Sicily or southern Italy, I can't remember, our troops were embarked on destroyers and were all as sick as hell and dropped all their small arms overboard, and the whole thing was a disaster of the highest order. And so we inquired, you know, how do they take their tablets and things, and it turned out that nobody had issued these tablets. And so all the swinging and all the work we'd done was in vain.
We still won the war, well,
yeah,
more or less.
well, yes, despite, I mean, the fact of having puking soldiers arriving was too much, I expect.
And the rest of your war was spent really with researching with the RAF.
I was then from the Queen Square unit, where I was also the registrar in neurology, which was a very interesting experience. I was sent over to Air Commodore Rumble, who was the head of the medical division in London, to do work with the RAF, and eventually ended up in uniform at Farnborough, where we had all sorts of things. And I was working on the problems of flying fatigue, and had the great good fortune of working with Dr. Marta Vogt, who had moved from London. I can't remember if she was at Guy's or not.
No, I don't think she was. She was
but she was
she won the Nobel Prize, didn't she?
She was the expert on the adrenal cortex, and she was working at the National Institute for Daring Research outside Reading, and I went there, and she very kindly lent me labs and animals, and I worked on rats and did bilateral adrenalectomies, and we did cold tests on them, and then gave them hormones and used, and so that I set up how to test adrenal cortical hormone in human urine. And at that point I got into, no, I was already in uniform, and we then started using RAF volunteers for giving specimens. And this, in fact, was the first occasion that the adrenal cortical hormone was successfully extracted from human urine.
The stimulus for this work was a bit unusual, wasn't it, you told me?
Well, the actual stimulus was that the people with Matthews, Dr. Matthews was the head of the laboratory at the RAF physiology laboratories, explained that they had captured a ship coming from Argentina full of oxyadrenals going to Germany, because they, if you remember, had switched sides rather rapidly after the beginning of the war. And it was felt that this must be something to do with flying. They thought it was actually to do with night flying, and that if you ate a lot of adrenal cortex, that you would be a better night flyer than if you weren't. You know, Cat's Eyes Cunningham. So the idea was that he should be fed with large quantities of adrenal cortex eventually. But then, because I was put on to flying fatigue rather than night sight, this switched into flying fatigue. And I did this work for a year or two. We used one or two fairly modern techniques to recognize the
This
substance.
was very early work on
It was very
beforehand.
early. In fact, the people from the States came over and only exclaimed that we seemed to be well informed on the subject and went away. The odd.
So far, though, no mention of kidneys. How was it that your interest in renal disease was
Well,
awakened?
when I went to Barts as a houseman, which I did by telephone from Oxford, rather surprisingly. When you think of nowadays, I rang up the dean and asked him why he hadn't sent me a notice to say that the jobs were up, and he was very hurt about this.
Yeah.
And then he said, did I want to work with him? And I said no, and this cut him to the quick. But anyway, I was then given I got the house job to A.E. Gow, who was a well-known name, particularly on physical science. And you at Barts, you were a junior houseman, then you became a senior houseman. When I was senior houseman, and there was really nobody in charge because everybody had gone off to the wars, and so one was left running a thing. And Dr. Gow, although he'd lived at Barts for quite a lot of the time, didn't really appear in the wards very much. So I was left on my own, and there was a bomb that fell into the opening of the St. Paul's Underground one morning in the rush hour. The result of this was that everybody on the stairs coming out of the underground station fell backwards. And one of the people who came in from this was a boy from the country, a big stalwart lad of 17. And he lay in a bed with a very bruised thigh. And he seemed to be doing very well, so I paid not too much attention to him and let him go for walks and things. And then on the 7th day, he said to me, I've not passed any urine, or whatever he used for the term. And so I said, well, go out there and do it now, and quickly, you see. So we went out, and he came back, and he said, I'm very sorry, I can't pass any. And this must have been 41, 42, something like that. Mm. The work on crush syndrome had just been seeing the light of day. So I thought, this is the crush syndrome to myself, which rather surprised me. And I went through the literature, and I saw the name Bywaters. Bywaters and Stead were almost the only people who'd done any work since the publications in the German literature from the First World War on trauma kidney failure. And I had before the war worked in Austria for a short time, and there they were looking at people who died and doing tests for the level of urea in tissue with a man called Konchek, who was working in a big pathology department by Beitzke in Graz in Austria. And so that I got Bywaters to come and see this boy, and who was a fit, charming young fellow, somewhere from the country, who found his way into London. So I said to Bywaters, what do I do? And he said, well, there's nothing you can do. And I said, what's going to happen? Oh, he said, he'll die between the 12th and 14th day, which he did, more or less. And it seemed this rankled in my mind really from that time on. And then when I later on went to work on malaria, well, then on the one side we had the interest of acute renal failure from malignant tertian fever, blackwater fever.
Blackwater fever.
My interest was aroused again. I remembered this boy, and then when the time came, I was still in the RAF and running this unit because James Reed, with whom I'd worked as an inter-services research unit on malaria, which had come about in a rather not unlike the work on the motion sickness, because the 8th Army, who ran from east to west along North Africa, driving Rommel before them and his famous army, they all fell on their backs ill. And somebody, a technician in fact, by the name of P.G. Shute, who came from the tropical medicine school, was sent out to see if he could recognize what was the matter with them. And he found they all had tertiary malaria, so subtertiary malaria. And And then, so we were then, it was inquired as to what they'd done about anti-malarial drugs, and mepicrin was the order of the day. So the senior medical officer of the 8th Army said, "What, hasn't this been issued?" And nobody had any mepicrin. So he said, "Give them a triple dose." So they had a triple dose. And they all went very yellow and very ill and fell on their backs. And if it hadn't been that Rommel's army had had dysentery at the same time, they'd have gone back to Cairo as fast as they'd come across, or faster. And so at that point, the alarm bells went up, because of course we still had the war in the East, and malaria was killing a lot of people in the East still. And so I think it was Churchill himself who demanded there be an inter-services research unit to look into malaria and find a cure other than mepicrin, as it wasn't safe to carry on the war in the Far East with a single drug. And this is, and then through that, of course, I met the ideas, although we never had one in the country, of acute renal failure due to black water fever.
So in 1946, you actually started working with Bywaters eventually.
And in 1946, I wrote to John McMichael, who was the acting head of the Department of Medicine at Hammersmith, asking if I could bring an artificial kidney and work there.
How did you first hear about Kolff's work and the artificial kidney?
I had sent to me by somebody his thesis, which he wrote, I think, in 1942. Now, I could read Dutch,
of course,
reasonably well, and so I read this, and I was fascinated by this, and it struck me, rather than as it had been used by Kolff and by Niels Orwell at that time, for renal failure of any kind, didn't matter what, that this might be a cure, it might be a way of getting through the problem of acute renal failure. And went to Hammersmith with this particular thing in mind, and so concentrated largely on getting patients who had acute renal failure.
Did Kolff bring the kidney across, or what? Because he gave away a number of...
He came over later.
He came over later, yes. So he sent the kidney across.
This is one of the 6 original Kolff kidneys.
And you were the first people to use it outside the Netherlands.
Yes, yes.
Before the United States and before elsewhere in Europe.
Quite a long time, yes.
And you treated, what, quite a number of acute renal failure patients?
We treated some, and we got 1 or 2 through, but it was not an easy job, because you had rubber piping, and you had it was full of all sorts of problems, and it was very interesting. And I'm always sorry I never looked into this, that they all had a rigor after about 20 minutes, and they'd go blue, and then they'd have a rigor. And of course, this was all the horrible things in the rubber piping that we used to go into this.
This was old-fashioned red rubber.
Yes.
No plastics in those days.
Yes, and they had these lovely rigors, and it was quite plain that this was a pulmonary shutdown of some sort.
Yes.
And but you know, we had our hands full in dealing with acute renal failure.
How long did the dialysis take from start to finish? From
I used to
up
set it up in the day and dialyze all night, and then go to bed, and the patient would be a lot better. I'd be a lot worse, and would then be woken up about midday, I think, to say the patient was worse again, because in the beginning we hadn't appreciated the intravascular volume, and although with the bubble trap and things in the old machine, the old Archimedes screw machine, you controlled approximately the volume inside the machine and what was in the patient. This was very crude, and I think we always overloaded them. You
modified the machine, didn't you, to make the volume more easy to
No,
follow?
this was Amburger who produced a metal container which enclosed the coils of cellophane and stopped this ink, because you could actually get in 21 litres of fluid into the actual dialysis machine.
Wow, so it had a huge extracorporeal volume.
Enormous extracorporeal volume. And so that it was no surprise that we had these problems. Somewhere about midday, I'd be woken to say that patient A, B, or C was not as well as he was when I went to bed, and found him in left ventricular failure, and we had to go through all this and try and get them through. And we usually got them through and managed to dialyze. I don't know what I can't remember now the biggest number of times we dialyzed anybody, but it was probably half a dozen, but no more.
I noticed in your paper that, that early paper in 1948, that there was one patient with aspirin poisoning whom you dialyzed, which must have been the first, one of the first, if not the first time that dialysis was used for getting rid of a toxin.
For that, yes.
Since Abel and the dogs, of course, in 1913.
The Abel and Roundtree, of course, used
showed that
aspirin.
you could get aspirin out.
Yes, well, they showed that you get aspirin out and urea, which was almost incidental that they got urea out. And they used, they didn't use sausage skin or cellophane for this. And they had great difficulties with their artificial kidneys. But then, of course, in the 1930s, the German people were working on artificial kidneys, but never really went through with it. They demonstrated that they could get urea out of people.
Yes.
But they didn't really...
This was Haas.
Yes, there was Haas and all this group. There was a whole lot of work on it, but they never really got through to the clinical side in any major way. And so by the time that there were war injuries and subsequently, the Germans weren't in the field at all.
You said you visited Kolf in Kampen at one point.
Yes, I did. I went across to Kolf in '47. And he used to work at his home a great deal, and I think, as I told you, that his children and this was in his sitting room, and there was a little desk that he used to sit and work at, and his children crawl under him, over him, and round him.
He'd keep working.
And he didn't notice them, I don't think. And he had the most extraordinary ability to concentrate. But the thing that fascinated me most of all at that time, because we had already devised the oil and sugar emulsion for treating patients so that they wouldn't have any nitrogenous substances.
Let's talk a little bit about this, because of course one of the things that's striking is that after this very early start, I mean the first dialyses outside Sweden and the Netherlands were done in the UK, then Britain more or less abandoned dialysis for almost 10 years. And you were largely responsible for that, along with Graham Bull, I think.
No, I don't think so.
That's not fair.
I was not responsible. I was, in fact...
I'm provoking you.
I was the other side. But political issues arose, and dialysis was thought to be a rather messy, unnecessary thing, because we had demonstrated that we could get patients through with very careful conservative management.
Of course, these were very different patients from what we see today. They were
but
younger.
What is interesting, of course, we had well over 50% of the patients were following abortion, and they were mainly backstreet abortions.
Yes, backstreet
and
illegal
then got acute renal failure. And these people we could get through with the very strict conservative management, which was very difficult to achieve, actually. And
the mixture wasn't, your mixture was of high-calorie mixture was very difficult. Did you take it yourself to try see what it was like?
I tasted it, of course.
Yes, I tasted it too.
But some of them, or few of the patients, drank it with pleasure.
Yeah.
And if they vomited, we filtered it and gave them back so that we didn't lose the electrolytes. And they took it all in good part. And there's a famous picture, I don't know if it appeared in one of the publications, of a girl whose blood sugar was about 450. And she was on this treatment, and she was very well, thank you. We got a German professor who came in to look at it, and he saw this girl. We asked him what he thought was the matter with her, and he gave a long dissertation on anything but renal failure. And we said, well, our blood sugar is 450, and he frankly didn't believe it. Anyway, this girl made a complete recovery, as did, I think, 7 out of 12 or 8 out of 12 acute renal failures following abortion. And we published this, I think, and I gave a paper on this in Belfast, I think it must have been, at the, which society was it?
Probably be the Medical Research Society, because I don't think
No,
the Renal Association, which
no,
will come
no,
to, I
no,
mean, it was only meeting in London at that time.
it was not purely medical, it was a scientific association.
Doesn't matter.
What?
Doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter what it was. And we went over. And by that time, first Bull came sometime in 1947, and then Ken Lowe came in 48. So we then had 3 people working on this problem. But what was clear at that time was that the patients with failure following backstreet abortion were anabolic. And it was relatively easy to control them because they could look after themselves. Whereas the people following trauma or surgery or anything of this kind were anabolic. Well, were not anabolic, but catabolic. And they were much more difficult to handle. And you couldn't handle them without dialysis, in my view. But this was not the view taken by Graham Bull and the authorities at Hammersmith. And so Joekes was issued that dialysis would stop.
Yes.
And so unwillingly I turned to looking at acute renal failure in other ways with really, and looked at particularly at the acute nephritic people at that time.
So you weren't a particular enthusiast for the Conservative regime at that time? It was Graham
yes, very much so. Oh yes, we set that up straight away from the word go.
It was a very influential paper, and it certainly influenced dialysis in the UK.
The thing, of course, was I always remember a patient coming in with acute renal failure who said, "They're drowning me." I always remember that. But in the early days, before I was joined by anybody else, we already had conservative management in relation to water. But as I think we discussed yesterday, that when in 1956 I was invited over to Paris to work in the Necker with Professor Amburger, he had working with him Georges Maté, and a book eventually was published which Maté wrote on water. And in this he underlined our error in thinking that a litre of water was what was safe to give to people in anuria, as about 600 ml of water was produced in the body by catabolic processes, and so that the actual amount that was free to give them was only about 400 ml. But that was Georges Maquet who did that work in the Necker.
It's a very important observation.
Extremely important. And he subsequently went back to pediatrics, where he came from, and became a hematologist in pediatrics, and really didn't stay in the nephrological field at all. But he was a highly intelligent person.
Of course, you were working also on for some time on transplantation during the 1950s.
In 1948-9, I remember having lunch with one of the surgical assistants of the chair of the professorial unit now, James Dempster, with Ian Aird, who was a professor of surgery. And at that stage, there were some rumors that somebody in South America, and I can't remember who it was treating people with acute renal failure by implanting on their radial arteries an ox kidney. And Ian Aird said to me, "Now, why aren't we doing that?" And I said, "Well, nothing in the world would persuade me to have a foreign kidney put into my circulation if I was dealing with, whether or no I had acute nephritis. This was not my idea of how to set about it." Well, he said, why don't you and James go down to Down and solve this problem? I'll give you 6 months, he said. Go down and solve the problem of transplantation.
Transplantation in
Yes.
6 months.
And James,
Xenotransplantation at that.
What?
Yes. Xenotransplantation. Foreign
that's
kidney,
right,
yeah.
yes. So this time, so down we went. And I went on certain days. I wasn't in his unit at all.
We should mention that Down House was Charles
Down
Darwin's
House was Charles Darwin's house where he lived for many years before he died. And this had been bought by the Royal College of Surgeons, and it had, as a member, one of these surgical urologists who was extremely crafty at passing a catheter on all the gentlemen with obstruction. And he made a large sum of money from this, which he gave to the college with the view that it should be altered to, in Down House, made a research laboratory. And this is where James, with his greyhounds, which was the suitable dogs
This
to
was
do.
Jim Dempster.
Yes, James Dempster, to down there. And we started looking at what was considered to be the only way of getting a transplanted kidney in the neck. And this, we published a paper showing that these kidneys didn't work normally, and there had been some previous work in the mid-30s in which somebody had tied a non-elastic ligature around the ureter, partially obstructing it, and the kidney behaved, so far as you could interpret the older data, exactly the same way as these kidneys in the neck. And so we decided that the right thing to do was to implant the kidney, not in the neck, with the ureter coming to the outside and stenosing, that it should be put into the iliac fossa with the ureter implanted into the bladder, so that you would run up against this stenotic problem of the ureter. And this proved to be so that this kidney, these kidneys worked perfectly normally. And it was largely James Dempster's really beautiful surgical techniques that made all this work possible. And I was really there only looking at it a functional and electrolytic point of view, to see what was happening. And we wrote 2 papers on this, one on the neck kidney and then the kidney in the RAF, and tried to publish it in this country. But none of the journals would accept it. They said that transplantation was not for the likes of us, and the kidney transplantation was not, I think, as I suggested, not quite British. And so we had to send it to the Actimed Scand, where the papers were published eventually. And I think a lot of people thought for a time that this work was being done in Scandinavia.
Well, of course, Peter Medawar was several times said publicly that as an immunologist he felt that transplantation could never become a reality even within his lifetime.
Yes, indeed, and this, of course,
that
this
influenced
was to my
an awful lot of people.
Yes, this was to my great cost, because in 1956 I applied for a unit for transplantation from the MRC, and they sought the an outside adjudicator of this plan, and went to Medawar, who said that there was no question of kidney transplantation, xenotransplantation, being solved except at cell level, and so that my request was turned down. And so unfortunately we lost another chance of leading the world in transplantation, because by that time Hume and Merrill and these people had come over to see our work on the dogs, and had gone back and had started up transplantation without really a great deal of thought about it, and did a lot of transplantation, and all these patients died. And by this time Dempster had demonstrated the immunology of an organ as opposed to skin transplantation, and they all died from organ rejection. almost the work that James then undertook was that he would take a pair of dogs, he would transplant one kidney, and from dog B into dog A, which had been nephrectomized. No, it kept one kidney at that stage, that's right. It kept one kidney, and he implanted the kidney from dog B, and this would reject somewhere between 10 and 15 days. And with all the histology and the change in the plasma cells and the work that was going on in Sweden at that time on immunology of organ transplantation, which was certainly James was entirely conversant with. And then he, after that had happened, he took the second kidney from dog B, transplanted it into dog A, and this then was rejected in 48 hours. And by 24 hours, the kidney had swollen twice normal size, anuric, temperature of the dog went up. And if this kidney was removed from the circulation, the dog immediately appeared to feel well, his appetite came back, he started running around the laboratory and was perfectly fit. And so here was a rejection which was accepted as a definite proof that this was a rejection on the basis of an immune phenomenon, but particularly because of the second kidney having a hyperrejection.
So those very important experiments have been nearly forgotten, I think, by many people in the transplant community.
James Dempster had a very large number of publications. He was unfortunately dismissive of other people's work, and this didn't help.
You put that politely.
in people accepting his work. And certainly Medawar, although, and actually James Dempster was a very good painter, and he made a very nice painting of Medawar at one point, but I don't know where these paintings have gone. I rather think Medawar's got that one, or he's dead, but he may have taken it with him. But he was a confirmed communist, and so it was very difficult to get discussions about factual observations on these kidneys with James, because he preferred the intellectual discussion to factual discussion, which was a very interesting phenomenon. And this is why his work has not been as accepted, and particularly because he went over, and this must be in about 52, I think, that he went over to Egypt, where he was promised the earth, be it out to start doing baboon transplants, kidney transplants into humans. Unfortunately, their promises, as was to be expected, didn't materialize, and he only managed to transplant a single baboon kidney, which didn't work. And during the year that he was outside the country, earning quite a lot of shekels in Egypt, he rather lost his place in the queue on the surgical side in Hammersmith. And although he eventually became a reader, he'd been sidestepped, as it were, and and his work with it, and so the transplantation took very much second place to the artificial heart,
yes.
Which, what was his name who was doing the work? Huh.
At that time, I'm not
No,
sure.
but somebody was working on excorporeal heart. And
so you left transplantation.
I left transplantation at that
but
point.
you had gave you time to do some very fruitful other things, and
I then moved from Hammersmith to Mary's, and I was very fortunate in the sense that Murky, who had been working with Kark, came over and showed me how he'd been doing renal biopsies with the Wim Silverman needle, and I started this doing the transplants very soon after arriving at Hammersmith, at Mary's, and
Biopsies.
with biopsies, kidney biopsies, and was very fortunate that I was interested at that time, particularly in the nephrotic syndrome. And these were very easy kidneys to biopsy because they tended to be large and soft. And so that my results were very good indeed, high up in the 90% of successful kidney biopsies. And it wasn't until later that I switched to being interested in acute nephritis, as it were, a sidestep from the nephrotic syndrome. And it was, I think, in a way, I would be most impressed in looking back that clinically I recognized there were two types of acute glomerulonephritis, and that they were quite different cardiovascularly, and that the acute glomerulonephritis of the focal type didn't have the cardiovascular implications that one saw with the acute nephritis of the typical post-streptococcal throat type that we have been taught. And this turned into be the acute hemorrhagic nephritis, if you like, which Wilson and others at the London Hospital had put down as a very small and unimportant group, and didn't really analyze very effectively in their quarterly. There was the pathology journal which they wrote about it, and then they never pursued it, I think, in any detail. Ellis and Wilson, I think, didn't enlarge on this.
Of course, you were lucky to have a marvelous team with
and I was extremely fortunate that Robert Heptonstall was one of the pathological lecturers at that time, and we decided that we'd start looking at the renal biopsy material, and I started learning pathology from him, and he very reluctantly and unbelievingly thought that there were two forms of acute nephritis, and I said, well, look, clinically I can tell you which it's going to be. And eventually, because we had the proof before our eyes and he could see it, he believed that we had two types of glomerulonephritis. But we first published the papers together on nephrotic syndrome.
It's a wonderful series of papers in the
And then we
journal.
published a paper on acute glomerulonephritis, on focal glomerulonephritis, to differentiate it from the post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis. And I still don't know. I had a lot of clues, and fortunately, because Heptonstall, although having been promised the chair in pathology at Mary's, was not in fact given it for various reasons, and went over to the States, where he made a very great name for himself.
Of course.
And became the head of the biggest pathology department in the world, I think, at Johns Hopkins, and was very happy there. But
he's still working on a new edition of his book on renal pathology right now, I gather.
And after a bit, he rather lost interest in the kidney, which was a pity. But it was sad, because I think between us we might have done a great deal.
Well, you did achieve a great deal, I would feel.
Yeah, but I don't think we achieved
classics.
as much as we should have done.
No, well, life is always full of regrets.
Because when Heptonstall went, I started working with the immunology work at Middlesex with Deborah Doniak. But it was with very crude antigens that we used, and so that one could see that here was some evidence of immunological work in some of them. But you couldn't say which immunological type, and I felt very disinclined to publish anything. She was all for publishing, and I said, you know, it's all a bit vague. So we never published this. It was a great pity, really, because it was the first step in immunofluorescent work on the kidney.
About when were you doing this work?
That must have been 59, 61.
Yes, that was very early.
Yes.
I think the first paper on fluorescence on renal biopsies was from Kark's lab in '59. So that was actually
no,
just
we
at
were
the time
right,
the
and of
first
course
work was
Deborah
being
Doniak
done.
became, and then eventually the pure antigens and antibodies were obtained, and it was possible to do these, which when they were just a crude lot all taken together, I didn't feel was adequate to publish, but we disagreed on this.
Just about that time, of course, the International Society of Nephrology was founded and had its meeting in Avion, and you were involved with that.
Yes, at that time I was the organizing secretary of the Renal Association in this country. And we had everybody from all over the world of interest, except the stop flow mechanism, who came and talked to us to the association. And
tell us a bit about the beginnings of the Renal Association first, because it, of course, antedated the International Society by 10 years.
Yes, it did.
How did it start? What was your role in that?
I think Bruin Lewis, who was at KCH, I think, AAG Lewis of post-pituitary fame, was interested in, and he, I think, was instrumental partly in founding it. And then we got Osman, Dr. Osman, who had a unit for renal failure at Pembury. And we invited him to be the chairman, the first chairman of the Renal Association, which he kindly agreed to do. Inevitably, his views on renal failure and renal disease are very different from those that we now hold. But on the other hand, he was the first person in this country, rather like Borst in Amsterdam, who was looking on renal failure as an entity and trying to treat it. And they both approached it not with the control of water and electrolytes, but by giving bicarbonate because of the acidosis. And so they both gave large quantities of bicarbonate to their patients, and many of them were quite a lot better. And undoubtedly some of these were sodium-losing nephritides, as well as being acidotic. And in that group, they certainly were a lot better for being given bicarbonate. And of course, Borst was important as the senior professor of medicine in Holland, and disbelieving dialysis, which Koloff started in Kampen, which was a secondary town, if you like, city in Holland. And he fought against Koloff's ideas of dialysis, and didn't make the path for Koloff as an academic in Holland easy. But that was not the main reason why he went to the States, because he, as well as Jaap de Graaf in Leng, who was a professor of medicine there, who was a nephrologist by inclination rather than, as it were, by profession, and they, at the end of the war, they were both so frightened of the Russians taking over Europe, or the greater part of Europe, that in fact Jaap de Graaf and some of his friends in Leiden had a boat with provisions for 3 months standing by. Amazing. So that if this happened, they could immediately get into the boat and sail away, probably to America, to stop the Russians moving into Holland, which is interesting because one doesn't think of that now. And Koloff went to America because of this fear, which was quite common amongst people in Holland, that the Russians were going to move in and take over. And so he didn't go because of Borst, whose actual claim to fame now lies not on management of kidney failure, but on his understanding of the cardiodynamics and the central venous pressure, and having his little machine which he measured the venous pressure in the neck, which he always demonstrated on his wife, which was rather sweet. She would be made to lie down and to show, because she had very good veins in her neck. And so he had a little thing, and he would measure the venous pressure in the neck, and to see, and he looked on this as a salt phenomenon. It was interesting. This was all, he looked at it entirely as Salem. And of course, in some respects, he was right.
Yes, and his understanding of volume regulation, of course.
Absolutely.
He was the first person to think that Verney's story was not the whole thing. One had to postulate volume receptors. Coming back to the ISN, though, what was your role as representative of the Renal Association in the Avion meeting?
I was then became with Brian Lewis, and both he and I were sent off as representatives from this country to the committee for formation for the first International Society of Nephrology. Now, Brian Lewis didn't speak any French, and I spoke it reasonably well, which I no longer do.
Only 5 other languages.
What?
Only 5 other languages.
But I was moderately polylingual, so I was a useful person there, and I had to speak for the British viewpoint. And there was a Dr. Coté, who was the doctor in charge of the Evian water, which was so good for the kidneys. And he felt he raised £40,000, which in those days was a lot of money. He raised £40,000 for the first international meeting at Evian, and wanted to do this as a publicizing Evian water. And it fell to my lot to argue the English case, and I said that we would withdraw if we couldn't have this as a scientific meeting based on kidney function and 1 or 2 other things. And this was not very popular with Monsieur Coté. And we used to meet in Paris, and he had a very grand flat. Was it Place Vendôme or one of these places? A very grand flat. And we used to have wonderful lunches. 8 or so of us. There was Professor Mack from Switzerland. I think John Merrill was on it from the States.
I was going to ask you about John Merrill because you met him before he came.
Yes,
you mentioned that he came to see you. What sort of man was he?
And we had a Japanese, and on one occasion when we have a meeting in Switzerland, and Monsieur Mack, who always referred to me as Dr. Joekes. Ah, Monsieur Joekes, he said, when I came in as usual a little late. Ah, Monsieur Joekes, he said, and come sit next to this brown gentleman, do you see, he said in some useful language, because we don't know what he's talking, they said. And so I sat down and I tried him any language that I knew and didn't get anywhere with him. But he kept on spouting about something. And after about half an hour, I recognized he was talking English. And so I had to inform the assembled company that he was English and I would translate for them what he was saying. So this was the first Japanese I met. And he brought some really dreadful electron microscopic pictures of kidneys. I remember that. And I was wise enough to say that I thought they were dreadful. And so I didn't go well down with Japan.
I just was asking you a second ago, John Merrill is somebody whom we can't interview, obviously, because we lost him.
Indeed not, no.
What sort of person was he? Because he had such a major influence in the United States and internationally.
Yes, he was an outgoing personality who didn't underestimate himself.
Again, you're being polite.
And he really, although he came to see our work, I think he came with Hume and 1 or 2 other people from the transplantation point of view. One got the feeling that he was telling us what we should have been doing, which may well have been right, mark you. But I remember mainly as a very good pianist, of jazz music, and really being extraordinarily good. And on 1 occasion, we were both invited to address the Iranian, or Persian as it was then, Society of Medicine in Tehran. And at that time, he had his first little stroke. So he didn't turn up. And he was going to make an inaugural address. And unwisely, I'd taken my wife, and suddenly I said, well, I'm terribly sorry. They said, I'm giving the inaugural address about 5 minutes beforehand. So I had no slides, and I had nothing. And I had to spout for an hour. But talking was never been one of my major problems.
Mm-hmm.
And there it was. She sat there listening, surprised to hear what we've been doing. She'd never found out before.
Mm. So coming back to your own career, of course, you're principally associated with what we've always known as the Saintly Peas, the urological hospitals in London. When did you move there?
I was invited there in 1959.
Mm.
But I had been there to see some patients before, and it was an interesting, and he was a gentleman from Pakistan who seemed to be having a lot of trouble. He had a raised plasma calcium, but it didn't seem to be that he had renal stones or anything, and so biopsied him, and he was interesting. And I remember there must be 15 now. Just shortly after I'd moved to 3Ps, and Roger Pugh was our pathologist. And I said, we got the biopsy done, and he had sarcoidosis. And Roger Pugh said, rubbish, rubbish, you see. So I had to go back and do a liver biopsy, and we got some sarcoid out of his liver. And so then this was the thing. And he did very well for several years on small doses of steroids. But then I lost sight of him. But because of this rather strange and diagnostic approach to a patient, at St. Paul's it was, I think, that I saw him, I was invited to go there to start renal biopsies, and rather reluctantly to consider the question of introducing hemodialysis at the 3Ps, because by that time I'd been running the RAF unit at Halton, which was very useful.
And the other thing, of course, you did there, which apart from pioneering dialysis and renal biopsy, was radioisotopes in nephrology. You played a big role in that, I think.
Yes, I was very lucky there. As I said yesterday to you, somebody who came to work with me as an MRC scholar, or whatever it was in those days, that was Tom Sherwood. And he had a very incisive and precise brain, and this was a great help to me. But I borrowed all the equipment from the MRC, the counters and the counting machinery and the writing equipment. So it was a very hugger-mugger renographic equipment that I had built. And then one day I was, my secretary told me that there was a gentleman coming to see me because he wanted to give some money to medicine. So I said, well, that was very nice. And it was somebody I'd been at Hammersmith with who had gone in to become a GP in the West End of London and saw a lot of rich people. And so I thought, well, this sounds all right. So he came in. He should be nameless, as he asked to be always. And he came in, he had a little moustache and a rose in his buttonhole and a lovely girl with him. And I said, how kind of him to bring his wife. And he hummed and hawed and said, well, and so we got that clear. And then he said he wanted to give me what was in those days quite a large sum of money. And I said, well, that was very kind. And he said, what would you do with it? I said, well, if I may, I'll go and write your report so that you know. No, no, he said, I want to know now. And anger I had at that time, just written about the anger camera, which was, if you remember, cross wires, which picked up
very early gamma camera.
Really, it was an early gamma camera, but on cross wires as opposed to on an iodine crystal. So I said, well, I would like to work on that and produce one. And he said, what would it cost? And luckily I'd made some inquiries already at the time. So I said it'd be £10,000, and he said, oh, whoa. And then I thought, well, if he's as offhand as all this about money, I'll have some new renogram equipment. So I had some beautiful new renogram equipment made at the same time, put it all down and said it was all isotopic work, and he was very pleased. And I got him to actually to say in writing that he was going to do this, because otherwise I could see myself with the bill on my own account. And so we had this built up in Edinburgh, where two brothers had come across from Canada to start building gamma cameras, and I forget their name. But this was a long trial, and here I was as a highly uninformed citizen on. I'd worked with Norman Veal at Hammersmith on isotopic medicine. We'd done quite a work with sodium. And this was, and I tried to find out what happened to sodium in acute glomerulonephritis. And I'd written a doctorate, as it were, paper on this. And just as I was leaving the hospital one night, I was called back for an emergency. And I left my car standing in the entrance to Madras, you know. When I came out in the morning, all my papers had gone. They'd all been stolen. I never published this work. But I'd had the great opportunity of working with Norman Veal, which was a great pleasure.
Yes, I worked with him too.
Because I was with him at Hammersmith when he was doing his early stuff. And Norman, of course, was a canon, as it were, in this field, so it was a great help. So that I had a little background. But nevertheless, here I was with a lot of isotopic stuff going on, and the gamma camera, which I barely understood. And then I was very fortunate in getting as a patient one Anthony Constable, who'd been a lecturer in Canada in physics, and then come over and was the physics master at Bruton School in Somerset. And he was there with some disease, and I was sitting talking to him one day, and he didn't really want to go on being a master at Bruton. And I said, well, come and be a physics man in the hospital. He said, what a very good idea. So I said, right, you're appointed. But this wasn't really how the administrators thought it should be done. And so this led to a great deal of trouble. But eventually it was, and very, very, very helpful it was. And I never could have gone on with this without his help. Because, of course, we had all the problems about safety and all this that came in. But there's no doubt that, and then with Tom Sherwood working on the rhinography side with me, the clinical rhinography side, we were able to demonstrate the enormous value of this. And I was, in fact, asked at one time if there was one renal function test that I would keep, and I had nothing else, what would it be? And I said rhinography, because I can tell how the two kidneys work. I can tell whether they're obstructed, but it didn't go down very big in the world at large, because this was published as an opinion in some review, medicine review, and people thought this was obviously a little bit offbeat.
Your work had a great deal of influence, certainly in the UK, in determining the introduction of radioisotopes and their use in nephrology. So you continued your career at the St. Leaps until your retirement?
Until I retired, yes.
Doing all these various things and still publishing actively into the 80s.
Yes.
I note from your considerable bibliography. Is there any other topics you wanted to raise with our audience during that period?
I think perhaps I've not emphasized enough the value of the renal unit set up in the RAF at Halton.
Tell us about that.
Which was very interesting, because Rumble, who was the director of medicine in the RAF, gave more or less carte blanche to set up a renal unit, because none of the services had a unit for dealing with trauma and the acute renal failure which came from this. And after a certain amount of discussion and looking round, Halton Hospital, which was in the Vale of Aylesbury, was thought to be the most suitable to set this up. And it had quite a big medical team there. And so I used to send National Health Service patients down there in renal failure in order to get the general management of renal failure understood. And then I had to think in the terms of what sort of artificial kidney we should have. And about this time, Pim Colliff, who was in Cleveland, wrote to me and said that he'd thought of a new artificial kidney, having recognized the problems of the extracorporeal volume of the old Archimedes screw kidney. And he said he was walking in the basement of the hospital of Cleveland, and he saw, believe it or not, large apricot tins which were ladled out and fed to the patients. And it suddenly struck him that he could get his dialysis loops wound round using some sort of mesh to hold it in, and put these into this with a light bulb fitting at the bottom and water coming at the top and flushing round altogether, and that this would make a very good dialysis unit. So I wrote him and said, would he send me a few of these, let me have a look at them. And I was still, I think I was at Mary still, that's right, when I got these. And so we took one of these, and we got hold of a fish bath and fitted one of Pim Colliff's dialysis machines onto this and dialyzed the patient. It worked very well.
This was the twin coil.
That was the twin coil. So this was the twin coil that saw its light in Europe. And I was very strongly against the big Scandinavian plate dialysis machines, of which, of course, Klaus Brunn was the best-known user, because I felt that reutilizing great big plates which had been exposed to other people's blood and feeding still in the terms of glomerulonephritis, this was not a very good thing. And the difficulty of sterilizing all this, that one should avoid at all costs having a re-sterilizable kidney. And so I said, right, let us build a kidney that will hold the twin coil, which, and of course with the RAF, I mean building a little artificial kidney, was no problem to them at all. They bustled up a twin coil artificial kidney. I think I had it first at, no, I think they did it at Halton and built several of these. And so we suddenly developed a unit with a non-reutilizable twin coil kidney, and because of the control of the extracorporeal volume, which Ambouget with his, the Ambouget Merrill kidney, as it was called, all in stainless steel and with a mesh round the big coils of this stopped the very enormous volume you could get inside an Archimedes screw. But here we had it ready-made. And so that I was very grateful to Pim Colliff for sending me these over. And in fact, I had one, and one of the people working with me was from Buenos Aires, and he took it over there. And some years later, I found he hadn't put it in a museum, and he hadn't used it, so I took it back, and it's gone. It went to the Science Museum as one of the original twin coil kidneys, and I don't know if it's still there or not, but in the exhibition, and if you remember, they opened it all.
Yes, they have a Colf kidney there, which was, I believe, one of the ones you used at the Hammersmith.
That was the original one at Hammersmith, which had wandered round. I think Bywaters had offered it round to various people. Never bothered to ask me, because of course I never saw Bywaters in all this exercise we did on. The only time he turned up with a patient who was an interesting patient, and in the long run it didn't matter, but he came in one midnight with some visiting professor from somewhere, no doubt across some ocean, and to show dialysis and how we were doing it, and he came in. And he would fiddle with it, everything. He started fiddling with me. I said, this won't do. No time faster, the lady was dead. And she turned to have acute cortical necrosis following, but she had an antepartum hemorrhage, not a postpartum hemorrhage. And I remember her, Yerbe. It was the only time I saw by an artificial kidney.
Yes, well, he did go back to rheumatology, of course. Anyway, don't worry.
And he went back to pathology, yes, yes. He was not a clinician in any sense of the word. He had a rubber stethoscope, I remember, which was a very remarkable affair, which, rather like a seashell, if you put it to your ear, you got a pleasant sort of noise coming to you, irrespective of what was at the other end. It was.
Of course, it's sad that the Halton Hospital has just been closed within the last year.
Yes, I mean, we had
with the reorganisation of the health
all the
service.
services sent their patients there, and I used to go to the various military hospitals all over the country to see them, and then send them to Halton, because they wouldn't deal directly with the RAF. You see, the Army and the Navy wouldn't deal directly with the RAF, because that wasn't quite nice.
They were very useful to British nephrology because of their ability to move the kidney to places.
And
they went
this,
to
of
the
course,
Falklands, of
yes,
course,
we developed a mobile unit, and they were a very efficient team and were very hardworking, and really pulled it off extremely well. We were very lucky. It was a very good unit.
So you were really associated with the RAF on and off over the very long
period, yes.
Well, Joe, it's been delightful talking to you, and I'd like to thank you on behalf of the International Society
very kind of you
and the Video Legacy Programme for giving you the benefit of your reminiscences and putting on record your many contributions to nephrology. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you.